What if one of the most sacred lines in Christianity was never meant to sound the way it sounds now? What if the words you were taught to trust were already altered by the time they reached you? And what if that alteration did not just change doctrine, but entered the soul like a hidden command? Stay with me, because once this opens, it becomes very hard to hear that verse the old way again. If this is your kind of threshold, subscribe now, because what follows is not surface religion. It is the buried layer most people were never taught to hear. There is a sentence hidden in plain sight inside Christian memory: love your enemies. Repeated so often, it feels older than thought, holier than instinct, safer than your own body. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous. Because once a sentence becomes untouchable, most people stop asking what it is actually doing inside them. They just inherit it, repeat it, defend it, build morality around it. But some of us have always felt the fracture inside certain holy words. Some people hear sacred language and move on. Some feel the distortion humming under it. And if you can feel that, you were never the surface audience for this. Because for a lot of people, that verse does not land like freedom. It lands like pressure. It lands like override. Like a command to become soft before truth has even been spoken. Like being told to make peace with harm before your body has even finished saying no. And that is not a small thing. That is not a footnote in translation. That is spiritual engineering. A sentence can alter more than belief. It can alter reflex, conscience, moral instinct, the pace at which you apologize, the speed at which you abandon yourself, the kind of pain you learn to call holy. A single phrase, repeated enough, can begin shaping the inner structure of a person until they no longer know whether their discomfort is discernment or disobedience. That is how deep this goes. And this is where it gets stranger. The problem is not only whether the verse was translated a little poorly. The problem is what each version awakens in the person hearing it. One interpretation produces clarity. Another produces compliance. One strengthens the inner center. Another teaches people to step outside themselves and call that virtue. So no, this is not just about language in the academic sense. This is about power, empire, institution, doctrine, control. The phrase was not only preserved, it was redirected. Reframed until it served empire, obedience, managed suffering, and spiritual control. Meaning does not need to be destroyed to be neutralized. It only needs to be redirected. That line stayed with me because it felt less like an idea and more like a key. Once it opened, too many other things opened with it. Because this happens everywhere. You do not always destroy a living teaching by erasing it. Sometimes you keep the words and drain the voltage. Sometimes you preserve the shell and redirect the force. Sometimes you take a teaching that could have made people inwardly free and you recast it into something much safer for the system that inherited it. What once awakened sovereignty gets made useful to empire. What once protected the soul gets turned into a script for obedience. And honestly, once you see that pattern, it is hard to unsee it anywhere. In the surface reading, love your enemies gets heard as moral sweetness. Be nice, be above it, be harmless. Absorb the blow, stay open, keep smiling, do not harden, do not resist too much. Do not make anyone uncomfortable with your pain. But the deeper current around agape, agapeo, does not need to mean sentimental affection. not emotional warmth, not forced tenderness, not pretending injury did not happen, not becoming available to violation with a spiritual vocabulary wrapped around it. It can point to something far more exacting: recognition, honoring essence, seeing what is real beneath distortion without collapsing into the distortion itself. That is a very different atmosphere. Not sentimental love, but recognition. Not surrender, but inner sovereignty. Not weakness, but non-capture. This is the part most people skip. Because the real question is not only what the verse technically means, the real question is what kind of person each interpretation forms. If you hear the verse as, "Be sweet to those who wound you," it can train self-erasure. If you hear it as, "Do not let the blindness in them seize the deepest part of you," it trains something else entirely, something steadier, something harder to manipulate. And yes, your body can feel the difference before your mind can fully explain it. The body knows when love is real. The body knows when compassion is being extracted too early. The body knows when spiritual language arrives before truth and asks you to betray yourself in order to remain acceptable. If something in this is already starting to move, tell me where the crack opened first for you. In the words, in the history, or in that old split between what you were taught to call holy and what your body always knew was false. Because once that crack opens, the whole polished surface starts looking different. And that takes us back to the older atmosphere around Yeshua, before empire smoothed him into something manageable. In that older world, Yeshua no longer appears as the softened figure of imperial religion. He appears as a teacher of the inner revolt, speaking in layers, speaking past the crowd, striking only those with ears to hear. He begins to feel less like a public moral instructor and more like a transmitter of hidden instruction. That matters, because a teacher like that becomes very hard to institutionalize without loss. Some teachings are not meant to sit flat on the page. They are not slogans, they are doors. They wait for a certain kind of hearing. They separate the listener who wants rules from the listener who is ready for transformation. And once a living transmission enters the hands of systems, interpretation becomes a battlefield. Councils gathered, boundaries hardened, official meanings were sealed. Nicaea, Constantinople, marble halls, robes, decisions made over words that had once moved like fire. Some texts were pushed out, some voices were buried, and what could not be burned could still be reworded until it served the throne. That is the part people tend to sanitize. Sacred language did not simply get passed down. It got filtered, framed, narrowed, domesticated. The deeper currents, especially the inward and destabilizing ones, became dangerous to institutions trying to govern belief from the outside. Because a person who no longer confuses holiness with self-erasure becomes much harder to rule. That kind of person is dangerous to any system built on guilt, obedience, and managed suffering. And this is where the Gnostic layer opens, not as trivia, not as ancient ornament, but as the wider, forbidden frame that reveals what the polished version was trying to hide. The Nag Hammadi texts matter here for that reason. Not because they hand us some neat alternative religion, not because they solve every historical question, but because they widen the field enough for us to see what later doctrine tried so hard to flatten. In the Gospel of Thomas, the emphasis is not outer conformity, it is what is hidden within, what is buried, what must be brought forth. The movement is inward, but not in a vague self-help way. It is remembrance, awakening, recovery of something the world trained you to forget. The hidden self. The spark. The part of you that existed before fear organized your identity. The part of you beneath role, wound, and performance. Then you reach the secret book of John, and the whole frame gets even more precise. The battlefield is consciousness, not just behavior, not just morality, consciousness. The archons, in this symbolic frame, do not mainly operate through obvious evil. They operate through ignorance, forgetfulness, false identity, surface identification. They keep people fused to appearance, fused to reaction, fused to injury, fused to role. They do not need to destroy the spark if they can keep a person from remembering it exists. And this is the layer everything else was trying to cover. Because once you see that, enemy stops, meaning only the person outside you. It includes the force of blindness itself, the distortion moving through the whole field. The machinery of fear that wants to pull both people into the same low state, the same confusion, the same hate, the same reenactment. So when the teaching says, love your enemies, the deeper reading is not approve of abuse, it is not excuse harm, it is not collapse your boundaries, it is not surrender your power. It is not walk back into the fire with a holy voice while your instincts scream. It is closer to this. Recognize what is happening clearly enough that you do not become captured by it. That is not passivity. That is mastery. That is not sweetness. That is sovereignty. Invincibility here is non-capture, less governable from the outside, less recruitable by hatred, shame, obsession, guilt, or compulsive reaction. You can still grieve, still burn with anger, still walk away, still say no, still protect what is sacred. But the conflict no longer gets to author your interior life. The enemy does not get your nervous system as a second victory. The blindness in them does not get to become the organizing principle in you. That is a very different kind of power. And this is where sacred language stops sounding symbolic and starts revealing what it has been doing inside the nervous system all along. Because look at what happens when people are taught to forgive too early, love too early, soften too early, reconcile too early, be the bigger person while they are still internally shaking. Something splits. Outside, they perform goodness. Inside, there is resentment, grief, exhaustion, numbness, confusion, sometimes a quiet disgust they do not know how to admit. That split is everywhere. Forced compassion can look like holiness, which, if we are honest, a lot of people have been doing for a very long time while calling it holiness. But underneath it is often shame-based self-abandonment. It is not transcendence. It is dissociation with a halo, and the body knows it. The body knows when the so-called love is false, extracted, premature, or operating ahead of truth. The part that really stayed with me was this. How many people have been told to forgive while still bleeding? How many people in families were pressured to keep the peace while something in them kept curling inward? How many people in relationships were trained to stay gentle while being lied to, minimized, manipulated, or slowly erased? How many people learned to call their own alarm unspiritual? That is where this stopped feeling abstract to me, because once a teaching is misused like that, it does not produce wholeness, it produces moral fatigue, spiritual confusion. A life performed from the outside while the deeper self goes quiet. The Gnostic response to that is not revenge. It is not bitterness. It is not collapsing into hate and pretending that is discernment. It is practical gnosis, recognition, discernment, transmutation, remembrance. Recognition means you stop handing your inner authority to other people. You stop assuming suffering automatically makes you holy. You stop romanticizing sacrifice just because someone taught you that disappearing gracefully is spiritual maturity. Pain becomes information, not a command to endure more, not proof you are failing. Information. Discernment means you stop reacting on cue. You pause and ask, what force is moving here? What in me got touched? What in them is unconscious? What pattern is trying to recruit me into its script? This is not excuse-making. It is not self-blame. It is clear seeing, so you do not dissolve into the drama and mistake reactivity for truth. Transmutation means you do not let betrayal, opposition, humiliation, or pain remain frozen at the level of the first wound. You metabolize it. You turn it into fuel, not because harm was good, not because you are grateful for being hurt, but because you refuse to let darkness write the final architecture of your inner life. And remembrance means the deepest thing in you was never erased. The spark is still there. The hidden self is still there. The part of you that belongs to what is real has not been deleted by what happened to you or by what you were told about what holiness should look like. And this is exactly why this never stayed in the ancient world. It entered ordinary life, quietly, repeatedly, through families, relationships, churches, and the language people use when they want you to disappear politely. This is where a lot of us live now. In that strange place where spiritual language sounds beautiful, but your body feels a little less alive every time you obey it against your own truth. You get told to let it go. Be soft, be kind, be mature, be gracious, turn the other cheek, keep the peace, do not make it bigger, do not stay angry, do not be difficult. And all of that can sound noble until you notice what it is actually doing. Because sometimes what people call peace is just paralysis. Sometimes what people call forgiveness is self-silencing with better branding. Sometimes what people call love is just your body leaving the room while your mouth keeps saying the correct holy lines. I think a lot of us have felt this without having language for it. That weird tiredness after doing the right thing. That inward collapse after offering grace you did not actually have yet. That subtle self-doubt that creeps in when everyone praises your maturity, but something in you feels less solid, less whole, less here. This is what happens when a person is trained to override themselves long enough. They become externally calm and internally divided. They look good. They sound spiritual. They are dying a little in places no one can see. And seeing that does not mean you become cruel. It does not mean you cling to resentment forever. It does not mean you build an identity out of being wounded. It means something finer than that. It means you stop confusing self-abandonment with compassion. You stop calling collapse mercy. You stop handing your nervous system over to the people who harmed you and calling that forgiveness. You learn that there is a difference between not hating and pretending nothing happened. There is a difference between transcending reaction and abandoning truth. There is a difference between love and capture. You can hold a boundary without hatred. You can refuse manipulation without becoming cold. You can see the distortion in another person without surrendering your own center to it. You can remain open in essence and closed in access. That matters, maybe more than people realize. Because the real victory is not becoming nice enough to survive the wound. The real victory is becoming so inwardly clear that the wound no longer gets to define the shape of your soul. That is non-capture. That is remembrance. That is what makes a person less governable by guilt, by fear, by pressure, by spiritual theater, by all the old phrases used to keep them manageable. And once someone reaches that point, they are very difficult to rule. They stop waiting for permission to trust what their body knows. They stop offering themselves up to every altar that asks for softness before truth. They stop confusing goodness with availability. They stop calling disappearance love. You do not need to force every layer of this at once. What matters is whether something in you recognized the signal, whether some buried part of you knew exactly what this was pointing to. Because the real question is not whether you liked this, it is whether something in you remembered. What in you answered when these words reached it? Was it relief, resistance, anger, peace, recognition, confusion? Was it that strange feeling when something sounds new and familiar at the same time, like you are not learning it for the first time so much as hearing it return to you? I want to know that part, not the polished answer, the real one. Because sometimes what matters most is not whether you adopt the whole framework. It is whether a buried part of you sits up when it hears the signal. Maybe that is enough for now. Maybe the point is not to force a conclusion, but to notice what was touched, what was disturbed, what was remembered. What no longer wants to rush past old sacred words just because they arrived wrapped in authority. Because sometimes the buried thing is not a secret fact. Sometimes it is a buried reaction, a buried refusal, a buried knowing. The part of you that never fully agreed to call self-erasure love. And maybe that refusal is not rebellion in the shallow sense. Maybe it is the spark refusing to forget itself again. If this transmission met you somewhere real, subscribe. We are not done with this layer, and there are older doors still waiting to open.